Okay. My name is Anna, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion about our author Eowyn Crisfield's new book, Bilingual Families. It would be helpful to say that, a practical language planning guide. I am editorial director at Multilingual Matters, and I'm joined behind the scenes by my colleague Laura, who will be running all the tech for me, which I'm very grateful for. So, Eowyn Crisfield was raised as a monolingual in Canada, but she discovered a passion for languages and linguistics, which has shaped her personal and professional lives. She's lived in 5 countries and learned bits of countless languages, but speaks 2 fluently and 1 more reasonably well. She's worked as a language teacher and teacher educator for many years, and through this came to work with multilingual families as well. She developed her approach to family language planning over 15 years and through working with hundreds of families around the world. In addition to her work with families and schools, she's also a senior lecturer at Oxford Brookes University in the UK, which allows her to connect her practical work with her research. She has 3 children who are all multilingual to varying degrees, which I think we'll touch on in a bit, and a mostly monolingual husband who tries very hard. I'm delighted to welcome you. Eowyn, thank you for joining us. I wanted to start, and I've been instructed that I need to tell you that we'll have a discount code for the book at the end of the session, so please hang on for that. Also, if you'd like to put your questions for Eowyn in the Zoom Q&A function, Laura will be monitoring them and she'll pass them on to me, and I will ask as many of them as I can to Eowyn towards the end of the session. But I will start by asking Eowyn some questions myself. So Eowyn, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Our pleasure. I wanted to start by asking you, obviously you grew up in Canada, which is an interesting language situation, but how did you become interested in languages and multilingualism?
So I grew up in a part of Canada that's completely monolingual. I mean, Canada does have interesting language things going on, but not where I was raised. And in fact, I remember very clearly the first time I met somebody who spoke another language, and I was 13 years old. We had 2 Chinese refugees that arrived at our school. And so, it wasn't something that I grew up thinking, oh, I want to be a linguist at all.
Yeah.
But I think just a combination of factors. One really good French teacher when I was in middle school, went on an exchange to Germany when I was in high school, and kind of came back actually not thinking about languages as things you learn, but as languages to doorways into other places. And so, my experience in Europe and Germany really showed me how having more than one language opens a lot of different doors to you, and not having it closes those doors. And so it's just something that I think grew slowly and then kind of, I would say, blossomed after I became a language teacher.
So you taught French?
No, I taught English to French-speaking people in Quebec.
I see, right. And so when you thought about your husband's monolingual, I mentioned in your opening blurb, was raising multilingual children always part of your plan when you started?
So I would say not when I was younger by any stretch of the imagination, but because I learned French as an adult, I think and then because of the graduate work I did, I really reinforced that idea of the positive benefits of bilingualism in lots of ways. And so once I was a fluent French speaker and married an American, I realized that if I wanted my kids to be bilingual, I was going to have to, speak French to them.
Yeah.
Which is what I chose to do. And so it wasn't ever something that was a long-term plan for me. It was just through my work and research, a realization that I wanted my kids to have an easier road to bilingualism than I had had as an adult.
Yeah.
And that I married somebody who spoke only English, so I better get to work.
And early on in the book, you say that if family language planning is the roadmap to success, important to know what the end goal is. And I imagine that a lot of new parents who aren't language teachers or linguists might think, well, I want my child to be bilingual, multilingual. But it's not as simple as that, is it?
It's not as simple as that. And I think that, There's a very big difference between raising a child to be bilingual or multilingual in a multilingual environment. So for example, families who are raising children in India don't need to have a family language plan because they're surrounded by different languages that are used in different ways. But if you're making a decision as a kind of a nuclear family unit or a small community, you really need to think, because it takes a lot of input to develop a language fully. And the fewer people who are using a language with a child, the more you have to think about making sure you get enough input. And so it's about recognizing that language, second, third, additional language acquisition is about developing different contexts and purposes for a language. And parents need to think through, what context do I want my child to be able to use this language in, and for what purposes? Otherwise, you end up with kids who have kind of a superficial, sometimes conversational fluency with a language, but they can't use it academically. So they can't go back to their parents' home country to university or, work in the language. And so for the everyday conversational language, you don't need to plan necessarily, but if you want something more substantive, then you need to think about how you're going to get there.
Yeah. And I think, because I was thinking that I think that layperson's understanding would be two perfectly balanced languages when you're equally fluent in two languages, and that's virtually impossible, is my
understanding. I think virtually would be the right term to use. I think you'll find bilinguals who will make that claim that they are, but really what happens to the brain when a child becomes bilingual isn't adding another brain that uses another language. It's the two languages together in the brain. And so it goes back to Jim Cummins' idea of, it's not two monolinguals sharing the brain space equally. It's languages kind of, intertwined and entangled. And so the way kids use them the way a bilingual child uses language is very different from the way a monolingual child uses language. And so you have to think through how you're going to make sure that they develop the level of proficiency you want in each of their languages. The more languages you have, the more you need to plan.
Right. Yeah. And I think, my next question is going to be, and I think you've sort of answered it, that the second question, I guess, someone who doesn't know much about languages or linguistics might have coming to the book is, why do we need a family language plan? Bilingualism, multilingualism is natural. Doesn't it just happen? Don't we just talk and they pick it up and it's kind of fine? So I guess what you're saying is that it's a way of, I guess, being brought up in a monolingual society is actually the unnatural of the equation, isn't it? And what you're doing is attempting to rebalance that, to help them get to a situation that's more natural that you might have in a multilingual.
Yeah, and it's about recognizing that in any society in which we live, there's a dominant and majority language, and that children will often, if that's not the language spoken by their parents, they may happily use their parents' language when they're young, but once they spend more time in that dominant society, majority language society, they'll start preferring that language and using it more. And so the parents need to have a plan for how they're going to make sure the other languages continue to develop, because children will move away from the minority parental languages really quite quickly once they start school, because they focus in on what seems to be the language that is most important in their environment, which is the school language. And so it's about that ensuring balance, that the children are learning the school language, but that you have a plan to make sure that the home language continues to grow as well. Otherwise, the home language will stagnate. And if you keep using it, it'll still stay there, but it won't necessarily grow into, a full-fledged proficiency. I meet a lot of adults who were raised in that situation. So say raised in the UK by a Norwegian parent and an English parent, and they'll say, like, I sound like a 10-year-old in Norwegian. Yeah. Because that's kind of the level our language plateaus at that everyday conversational level. But it's not really fit for purpose if you want to talk about politics or if you want to have a more adult discussion. That's what we need to plan for.
Okay, yeah, and I guess when the children get to teenage years, they need to be able to talk, and you need to get them into situations where they can learn teenage language, so they can talk.
Right, sure, and that they can, it's always about making sure that the children at every age have the language they want to talk about the things they want to talk about. And so the language we naturally use at home with our kids tends to be quite repetitive, and really it's about getting them to do what we want them to do. if we have kids who are mad about Minecraft and they're Minecrafting in English all the time, they're not going to be able to talk about it in the home language, so they just won't talk about it in the home language. Or they'll use English, or they just won't talk. And so we really need to look at the context that our kids want to use language in, and make sure that we're opening those doors in the home languages, because otherwise all the fun stuff happens in the majority language.
Okay. And it's really interesting what you were saying about when they get into school context and start to go out into the wider world, the minority home language can start to disappear. They don't want to use that. What is that true even if the minority language is, or the home language is English, and you're trying to dominant global language?
It's an interesting question, and I would say that English speaking parents have less trouble maintaining English as a minority language globally, because there's always a sense that English is useful and good, no matter where you are in the world. And as the kids get older, what do they want? They want the internet and social media and games, and that all happens in English. But I still do know of families who have had children, English speaking children, in school in other countries, who have been told your children aren't allowed to use English at school. So even when it's English, there is sometimes an effort of suppressing any language other than the kind of the dominant majority or national language. But I would say on the whole, adding another language to English is seen generally more favorably than keeping a home language in some circumstances that isn't English.
Moving on, I was interested in one of the things that the book does is give parents an overview of the latest research that feeds into your ideas about how family language planning works. And obviously your other hat is an academic. And I was interested in how you think it helps parents to have an understanding, even if it's a kind of basic one, of what academic research says and how that feeds into where they're going on this journey.
So I think it's important for two reasons. First of all, the more you know, the more confident you are about the choices you're making. And so, there are parents who feel a little bit insecure about the choices they're making. Is this the right one? Should I be using my language? When should I use it? And so having a bit of research, knowledge helps you be more secure in your decisions. But really, parents need to know the research, because everybody has an opinion about child language development. And I have met over the years families who have been bombarded with the most ridiculous advice. And even recently, I'm working with a woman right now whose son lives in the US. He's English speaking. His wife is Spanish speaking, and they've just had a baby. And they were told, yes, it's okay to raise him bilingually, but he'll have an 8-month language delay. Like, where does that come from? Like, that's a really specific bit of misinformation. Children who are bilingual don't have language delays because they're bilingual. They may have a language delay. It's not because they're bilingual, but also, where did 8 months come from?
Yeah.
And when somebody says that to you, it sounds so specific, but it's very convincing. And so if you don't actually know the research yourself, you will take that, you'll worry, maybe then we shouldn't do it. Do we want our child to be 8 months delayed? And so you need to have the research so that when people give you terrible advice, no matter how convincing it sounds, you can stand your ground.
Yeah.
And continue with the decisions are right for your family.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, you mentioned a very specific piece of misinformation, fake news about bilingualism there, but are there any common myths or kind of popular wrong beliefs about bilingualism, bilingual development that you come across?
Yeah, so the first most common one is that raising your child as a bilingual will delay their language development, that it's normal for bilingual children to have later language development, which is absolutely not true. It is often the case that bilingual children get diagnosed with speech and language delays and are told it's because they're bilingual, even when it's not. So that's a bit of professional misinformation. But even just kind of, softer misinformation, like your child will never be properly fluent in either. I had one gentleman ask me at a parent session once, I don't think bilinguals can ever write poetry. Is this correct? And I was like, I'm pretty sure not, but I can't quote you the research on that because I don't have it to hand. But his preconceived notion was that if you have more than one language, you'll never know one deeply enough to be a poet. And I think actually there's so much multilingual poetry now that shows that that's actually 100% the opposite, that it allows you to be more creative.
Yeah.
And so people come up with all kinds of crazy things, but the most common thread is that your child will have underdeveloped language at some point, either temporarily or permanently, if you raise them with 2 or more languages.
Yeah. So moving on more specifically, what kind of things do you look at when you're putting together a family language plan?
So you start with the basics of the mother's language profile and the father's language profile and the language profile of anybody else who is in the family, so who lives with the family or that the child spends a lot of time with. So it's really about knowing. A lot of times people say, what's the mother's language and what's the father's language? Well, if the child spends more time with the grandmother, that's actually more important. And so it's really getting a sense of what languaging is happening around the child on a regular basis. That's first and foremost. Second is parental stability. Where are they living and how long are they going to be living there? So for families who are thinking about adding in the local language where they live, that it's an important part to know how long they're going to be there. It is good to know about the parents' educational backgrounds in terms of if they had any particular educational needs, like dyslexia tends to be familial. And so that's a good thing to know in advance. Childcare plans, there's a lot that you need to know about, which is why, and I'm going to say this now, I may not be able to answer parents' questions precisely tonight because sometimes I need a lot more information before I feel I can give an ethical answer. And so sometimes it's a straightforward answer, and sometimes you really need a lot more kind of data about the family to help them see what the possibilities are.
Okay. And a lot of the kind of how to raise your children bilingually books kind of assume there's a nuclear family with a mum and a dad and everything goes swimmingly, and you have an extended family around and you can chip them off language breaks. What happens? How does bilingualism work if you're not in a nuclear family? Is it possible? And secondly, how do big life events, if your parents get divorced or one of them dies, or if you move kind of away from the language that you've been learning, how do things like that feed into the way bilingual works?
So every single life event or choice that happens that impacts the language input around a child will need to have an impact on your language plan. And so we talk about goal setting first because the goals are what is most likely to stay stable. But your language plan needs to be changed every time something significant happens. And so if the parents divorce, then you have to look at your plan and you have to remake it according to how much time the child is spending with each parent in terms of how much input they're getting. If you move to another country and you have to change the language of schooling, you have to look at your plan and you have to remake it and shift, your language goals away from, say, if you left one language behind definitively and you're moving towards another. And so that's where that knowledge base comes in. And it's where, I often get parents asking, do you just have a language plan I can use? Like, I don't want to have to do the work and make it, just, can you give me one? And I can give you templates, but there are too many things that go into making a language plan for each individual family for anything to be one size fits all. And so, when I make a language plan with a family, I've got my teacher hat on, knowing about schools and curricula and about special educational provisions. And I've got my linguist hat on, knowing about language development and input. And I've got my teacher hat on, knowing about special educational, and the parents need to take that and they need to say, okay, so in this best case scenario, this is our plan. And then something happens and they have to go back and say, okay, how does this impact our plan? What are we going to do about that? But essentially the parents have to be in charge of the big decisions and the adjustments that need to be made. And that's what I call my family planning, language planning system parents as language partners, because it's not just about the parents, it's about the partnership with, and if you're a single parent, it's not just about you, it's about the partnership with child childcare and teachers and, you know, babysitters and the swimming lesson teacher, everybody is involved. And so it's a big partnership, but the parents are in charge of leading the partnership.
And I think that point leads me neatly onto my next question, which is going to be how, apart from like language delay, which we've kind of talked about as not being, you know, the children might have a language delay, but it's not got to do with bilingualism. What happens when they get older and they just want to speak one or more of the languages? How do work make them a partner in the language plan, I guess?
So one of the things I emphasize is that you talk to your kids the whole way. You start talking to your kids about your family language plan when they're, you know, 1 year old. When you say, oh, how does daddy say that? Or how does mommy say that? That's an age appropriate discussion about languages in your family, and it grows with you. And so there's never a moment at which languages are not a part of your discussions. Anybody who has teenagers knows that you can't ever really get them to do what you want them to do. They've got to want it for themselves. And some teenagers are really amenable to being multilingual, and they're perfectly fine, and they'll keep working, and the parents can put them in Saturday school, and it's all great, and they're happy. And other teenagers are reluctant bilinguals and don't want to do the extra work. And then it's about keeping the lines of dialogue open, finding things that are meaningful for your adolescent, not meaningful for you. Not I want you to go to Saturday school so you can write in my language, but okay, what would you want to do? Would you join a football team? You know, what can we do that you would be interested in? So, you know, finding their currency, so to speak, but also remembering that if you keep using the language to them and you just are clear with them, like I get to make my language choice. It's the language of my heart. It's the language I'm going to parent you in. I always have. When they're ready to come back to it, it will be there for them. It'll be passive sometimes, you know, passive bilingualism. But when they're 19 and they realize, oh man, I wish my French was better, it's still, you know, it's still there. They'll need to reactivate it. It'll take some work. But the most important thing is if it's really important, you don't give up and switch to the majority language yourself. Unless you really feel that for your relationship with your child, you need to do that.
Yeah.
And that happens sometimes too.
Yeah. And I guess that is an interesting point as well. Is it ever too late? Like, because I think I certainly experienced this when I had children, that the whole having a baby thing takes me by surprise. And actually it's only when the dust settles, you know, a year later or something, I can imagine suddenly thinking, oh, I've been speaking to them in this language.
Yeah. Oops.
Kind of
happens a lot.
I haven't really thought about this, you know, by which stage they've had a lot of language input. Is it ever too late?
It's never too late, but the longer you leave it, the more the child is going to have to be a willing and hardworking participant. Is the bottom line. I mean, if you gave up when your child was 4 because they absolutely wouldn't use your language, by the time they're 19, they probably don't have anything left, because children lose languages very quickly. And so if they haven't heard it from 4 till 19, it may be gone. It doesn't mean they can't learn it, but then they're going to have to put in the hard work, the time and the hard work. And so it's never too late to learn a language. It is sometimes too late for some people who are less language inclined or have less language aptitude to become really fluent in the language if they've left it too late.
But if you decide that you need to leave the language when they're teenagers, for example, and I think you said that, you know, if you've got that far, they'll have a lot more passive language, and then if they decide they're older teenagers or adults that they actually would love to be able to speak to in your home language, then that makes it easier as well. It's probably worth persevering with. Yeah,
the longer you've persisted, the more they have.
Yeah.
It's most often not that they decide they want to be able to talk to you in that language, but they realize that job opportunities or university opportunities, or they meet a cute guy or girl, but something external usually motivates them. Yeah. If they're really resistant as teenagers and want to give it up, it's usually something external that brings them back. But you know, again, the more you persisted and the longer you made it, the more language will still be there for them. But you know, it just, you know, we always need to remember that every single person is an individual when it comes to their language acquisition. And so you may stop using your language with one of your kids when they're 12, and when they're 19, they're fluent again in a month. You may stop with another when they're 14, and by 17, they say they've got none left. Like, the individual variation, what we call individual differences in language learning, are the strongest predictor of how any particular person will acquire or lose another language. And so there is no kind of blanket statement that if you get to this age, they'll be able to find it. Again, it's about doing the best you can, having the open and honest conversations, making the decisions that are right for your family, not only for language, but also for your family, and accepting sometimes that language might be a casualty of that, and that then it's up to the child eventually if they want to get it back.
Yeah. And how do siblings fit into, because obviously it's relatively straightforward, I guess, to have a family language plan for one child, but what if their ideas are very different about which languages they'll speak when? And
yeah, no, I remember my oldest daughter, when she was 3.5, I think I asked her to do something in French, and she looked at me and said, "Mommy, you have your plans and I have my plans, and that's just the way it is." And I think that kind of encapsulates siblings and language. The best laid plans of parents are not always what siblings are going to want to do. There is a strong tendency for minority language children, so children who speak a minority language at home, to gravitate towards using the majority school language with their siblings, because that's the language they live in all day, and that's the language they play in. And so it's natural to continue that language at home. Some families manage to overcome that, sometimes by being very punitive, which I don't necessarily agree with, sometimes just by, having children who are more amenable to the discussions, and some families just let that happen. But it's like in immersion schools. One of the things we know is that it's difficult, if not impossible, to shift the language of play that children naturally gravitate to. And so sometimes the sibling effect is stronger on each subsequent child. So that's in my family. My oldest daughter is really lovely bilingual. And when we brought our twins home, she was almost 4.5. I spoke to my kids in French, and they had Dutch and English. And she announced the day we brought them home, "I'm going to speak to them in English because English kids are more fun." And that was the decision she made, and she stuck with it. And now they're teenagers, and she bugs them all the time that their French isn't good enough.
Yeah.
What can you do? But that was her strong, determined.
Yeah.
I'm not going to change. So I didn't try and change her mind, because her mind was not going to be changed, but it had a huge influence on their language development. It was very different from hers, despite having two parents doing the same things.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. And you mentioned that they speak Dutch, and you mentioned right at the start of the book that you were obviously living in the Netherlands, and when you decided to raise them multilingually, people basically said, well, Dutch is a very useless language, isn't it? Useful for going to the shops in the Netherlands, but
not even where we lived.
So I think it's probably time to move on to some audience questions. Laura is putting some through to me now. So the first one, and I apologize to everyone if I mispronounce your name. The first one is from Yelena, and she asks, is it enough to speak your language to your kids? Will they eventually start replying back in your language? My son is 5, we live in Oxford, and I speak Russian to him, but he keeps replying in English. I don't know if I need to push him to reply in Russian. He's very resistant if I put.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, one of the things that's important to do is to put yourself in your children's shoes and imagine what the world feels like to them. And so for a 5-year-old boy living in Oxford, whose mother speaks to him in Russian, but everybody else speaks to him in English, there are two important things to remember. A, English sounds and feels like the most important language to be able to use. But also, he hears so much more English that his English is likely much more developed than his Russian. So if he tries to say something in Russian, he has to work a lot harder and maybe can't say it exactly the way he wants to. And so he defaults to English because he feels smarter in English. And we all bilinguals, adult bilinguals, do the same. I mean, you know that feeling when you plan your sentence and you walk into the cheese shop and you spit it out in Dutch and you don't feel very good about it because you think you got it wrong. And they look at you and say, would you like to speak in English? And you're like, oh, yes, thank you. Kids are the same way. They know which language they're better at. And so applying pressure doesn't work, but those conversations with, this is why mommy uses Russian with you. This is why it's really, really important for you to speak, for me to speak Russian to you. And this is how I would like you to be able to use Russian in your life, to talk to your grandparents or to play games, to contextualize it for them in ways that are meaningful. And then to, make a plan with your child. What things would you like to do in Russian? So, I mean, obviously he's not going to say, I want to read War and Peace, but maybe if you say we can play Pokemon together in Russian, that's a way to get him to engage a bit more, because it's about recognizing that it's not easy for him, and he's not doing it to be, stubborn. He's just doing it because it's easier to express what he wants to say in English. So you've got to look at building his skill and his vocabulary in Russian so he can say more things in Russian.
That's really interesting. So even at a relatively young age, being kind of explicit with them about
absolutely
language plan and why you're speaking your language to them. And trying to go back to so the next question is from Michaela, and Michaela would like to ask about how to keep her daughter motivated. They're a German family. Daughter goes to a bilingual English-German school, but she's created a German bubble at school, so she's hardly speaking any English. Any tips on motivation would be very welcome.
So that's a hard question to answer without knowing if you live in an English-speaking place or a German-speaking place. Suspect by the question you live in a German-speaking place and you're hoping she'll learn English at school. And it's this, the same answer for the little Russian boy is try and find things she wants to do in English. So find, movies that she likes or TV shows that she likes, depending on her age. I don't usually recommend the use of technology for younger kids, but by 6 or 7 or 8, if they're going to be playing on apps anyway, find an app that has linguistic value and gives them more time in the language you want them to learn. So again, it's about finding things that are motivating enough for her to want to do in English rather than trying to pull her away from her German peer group.
Mm-hmm. Next one, Galia would like to know more about using mother tongue in day-to-day events. Should it remain one parent, one language, or should it be one language per event? Do I talk to our children in our local language, Hebrew, when we're with friends, or do I stick to English no matter what?
So again, I have to make some assumptions here. I'm assuming you live in England and Hebrew is your family language, in which case there is nothing wrong with continuing to use your own language, Hebrew, in other circumstances, in English-speaking circumstances, but you acknowledge what you're doing, because one of the things that kids do is they pay attention to to the language choices their parents are making, and from that they decide which languages have more value. And so if you use Hebrew all the time at home, but when you go out of the house you use English, you're giving your child a message about which language actually has more value in society. It's English, no matter what you do at home. And so kids they tune into these little choices and use them to help them decide what's a higher status or a lower status language, which one's more valuable or worth or useful. And then they pull away from the ones that they feel are less useful. So it's about acknowledging that sometimes we're going to use Hebrew in public, and if your friend is with us, you can translate to English for her if you want. But English, Hebrew is the language mommy uses with you.
Diane, who's the parent of an almost 3-year-old who doesn't want to speak either language, is asking if bilingualism isn't linked to language delay, and why do so many bilingual children get diagnosed with speech delay?
So a couple of reasons. First of all, kind of a prejudice amongst monolingual society against bilingualism because they don't understand it. But most commonly, it's because when a child is assessed for a speech or language delay, the most common first assessment they do is a word count. And so they assess the number of words they have, and they should have, 10 words by the time they're 18 months old or something. But a monolingual therapist and a monolingual assessment will generally only assess in one language. And so if you have like my twins had English, French, and Dutch, and I went through this every time we had a well baby visit, how many words do they have? And I would say, 10 in English, 10 in French, 10 in Dutch. And they would say, oh, only 10 words. No, that was 30 words, because it's the presumption that if a child has 10 words in English and French and 10 in French, they're the same words, but they're generally not. And so that word count ends up disfavoring bilingual children when you only count in one language. And then they're diagnosed as having a speech and language delay, when until 4 years old, you need to count the words and the structures separately.
And also Kai has a question. Can a persistent lisp be attributed to bilingualism in a 5-year-old with German and English?
No, not to any with any research I know. It is true that bilingual children sometimes develop temporary stutters when they're adding in a new language, but I've not personally read of any research linking lisps to bilingualism. A lisp is a speech issue. It's to do with the physiology of how they use the mouth. So it's not likely to be attributed to bilingualism. It's just to do with physiology.
Mm-hmm. I can see Laura frantically typing. Okay, so the next question is about how Eowyn sees the role of teachers in supporting family language planning, and relatedly, Dawn would like to know how important it is for family language planning to be included in learning in schools.
So are you asking me how I think it should be, or how it is? There's very different things. I think ideally, and in fact, I just wrote an article for the EAL journal called School Approaches to Family Language Planning. So that tells you what I think about it. I 100% think that schools should be involved, because the more a school knows about the family language profile and a child's language profile, the more everybody can plan to do their jobs effectively. That said, one of the biggest issues in raising bilingual or multilingual children outside of multilingual parts of the world is information. Nursery staff, early years staff, teachers, speech and language therapists, none of them get standard training on bilingual development as a part of their training. And so I wouldn't want a school to help with family language planning unless somebody in the school knows what they're doing. But ideally, yes, and the schools that I work with longitudinally, one of the things I do is I have one staff member shadow me and learn how to do family language planning with their families, so that it becomes a part of their intake with new children to develop a student language portrait and pathways. But that is, if you remember back to how many different hats I wear when I'm doing family language planning, it requires quite complex knowledge. And so it mostly, it takes the people I train 2 or 3 years to be able to, feel comfortable and confident with the advice they're giving. But I 100% think that schools and parents need to communicate better around the topic of their multilingual children and what the values are and what the parents' wishes and plans are for their child in the first step. And then having the school be an active participant in family language planning would be an amazing second step.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that's ideally schools and teachers are looking at knowing more about children and what's going on in their lives outside the classroom anyway, and language is just one facet of that, isn't it? So brilliant. Okay, any tips on how to introduce 2 languages spoken by one parent? Would you recommend rotating each language each week?
I mean, that's another, as I said, sometimes these questions are really hard to answer. It depends on how much time the parent spends with the child, and it depends on what your goal is for each of those languages. I mean, it's very difficult for one parent alone to pass on 2 languages substantively unless they get support in other ways. And so it's about thinking about, when I do family language planning, we talk about goal setting. You can have a conversational goal, a basic literacy goal, or an academic literacy goal. And once you've benchmark those, it gives you a better sense of how much input the child needs. If you decide you want to use 2, how you do it is completely individual. I've worked with families that did week on, week off. Very early in my career, I worked with a family that were French English bilingual, and they did Monday, Wednesday, Fridays English, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturdays French, Sunday everybody does what they want. It seemed really complex to me, but it worked for them. It's whatever works for how you live your life, but always looking at the balance of input and your goals and thinking, is this going to get me here? But ideally, if a parent is passing on 2 languages, you have to look at who else you can bring into your language plan to help support both of those languages more substantively.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And Carolina asks, what advice would you give to a parent raising in a minority language that's not his or her mother tongue? In my case, I'm her only source of English while everyone around speaks Spanish, even we with my.
So that's what I did with my kids. I spoke French to them, and between my husband and I, we spoke English. It can absolutely be done. But again, it's about, as much as possible, enlarging your pool of support. So English is quite easy to support by, television and movies and reading books. But if you can find a teenager who speaks English to come and play with your child 3 days a week for an hour, just play, read, it gives a little more kind of gravitas to the language if another person's using it with them too. If it's just you, the mom, they're like, why are you doing this? Because I know you speak Spanish, so I'm not sure what's going on. So as much as possible, try and bring in other people who can, and show how English can be useful or valuable, which arguably is quite easy to do as soon as your child is interested in, TV or the internet. But, we say it takes a village to raise a child, but when you're trying to raise a child as a bilingual or a multilingual, your village becomes really important.
Okay, yes, no, that makes sense. Caitlin asks, if both parents are bilingual, e.g. Spanish and English, and one speaks Spanish to the children and the other English to the children, what language should the parents speak to each other?
Now you're asking for relationship therapy. The first thing is, what language are you comfortable speaking to each other? Because sometimes, when you meet somebody and you have one language you use together, it's incredibly hard to shift to another language. I'm just trying to remember, where do they speak? Where do they live?
It doesn't say. They said they speak Spanish and English, and one speaks Spanish to the children, the other English.
Okay, so I guess part of the answer would be, it depends on where you live. So if you're living in a Spanish-speaking environment, what you're doing right now is one parent, one language, but you have to take into account everything else that's happening around when you look at that's going to be successful. So if you're living in a Spanish-speaking environment, they're getting a lot more Spanish than English, then I would say use English in the home. If you're living in an English-speaking environment, they're getting lots more English, I'd say use Spanish in the home. Again, it's about looking at the balance of input and thinking, how much are they getting of this one? How much are they getting of this one now? What do we need to change to meet our goals?
Mm-hmm. Does it ever cause issues if one parent can't speak the language that the other parent speaks to the children? So they kind of have and one can speak the language that the other parent speaks. Does that ever create issues?
Yeah, absolutely. And in different ways. I mean, one of the things that I see quite commonly is the mother speaks the minority language and the majority language of the father, but the father doesn't speak the minority language. And then you enter into all kinds of perceived notions of value of language. If it's only my mom and she doesn't have a job and my dad works and he makes the money. So sometimes there are imbalances in the perceived monetary value of language, and that's most often when the mother speaks the minority language. But also it can happen that one of the parents is a speaker of the majority language and doesn't value the minority language enough. Doesn't really, why do you have to do this Cypriot Greek thing? They're never going to use it. And that causes a lot of problems too, because the kids pick up on that. That said, you can be a monolingual. Like my husband is a monolingual, and he has completely supported my kids in their language acquisition because he thinks that being multilingual is great, and he hopes that they can be far better at languages than he was. And so the monolingual parent doesn't have to be able to use the other language, but they have to be supportive across the board, supportive in words, supportive in action. Like my husband used to read to our kids the French books, and they would laugh at him and they would correct him and he would go along with it. But to them was like, isn't this great? We can do something better than daddy. And it really supported their motivation. And so it's about both parents being supportive of each other's languages to the kids at all times. That's what you need, irrespective of who can speak whose or not.
Yeah. And I guess I suppose fundamentally what a lot of this comes down to, isn't it, is everyone in the family being on board with the language plan. And it's okay if one parent doesn't speak the language, if they're totally on board with...
Right, absolutely.
Whereas if they're kind of, well, you can do what you want.
Yeah. And I've worked with lots of families where one parent has been kind of quietly undermining the other. It happens because people value languages differently and multilingualism differently, and parents aren't always on the same page.
Yeah, okay. And Miriam would like to know, how do you think the pandemic will impact children's language development, e.g. children attending immersion minority language school who speak the majority language at home, do you think they'll bounce back having lost a whole year of that immersion?
That's a keep saying this, but that's a tricky question to answer. I think so. There are two different groups that are going to be affected. Children who are in an immersion program, so they're learning a new language at school that's a minority language, are definitely going to be getting less language input. How effective they'll be depends in large part on what the school is providing for them, what the school's able to provide for them, and what the children are engaging with. So if, for example, you have children who are learning Gaelic in Scotland, I've worked with some Gaelic immersion schools. If they're able to provide lots of resources and kind of, TV shows and songs and stories and books that keep the kids engaged, there may be some slide, but they'll pick it back up. And so there is no one size fits all. It really depends on how much they engage. But the flip side of that is children who are in school in English and don't speak English at home. There's a really interesting research project that's been carried out through the pandemic by the University of Reading about home language development and how their home languages are developing so much better. And we know that the better a home language is, the better the school language will develop. And so for minority, immigrant language, refugees, children who speak a different language at home, for them, there are some benefits. But for the children in immersion programs, there's very likely to be some slide. How much will depend on how much they continue to engage in that language while they're doing remote learning.
Yeah. Again, I suppose it's just a volume of input.
It's a volume of input, absolutely. Input and engagement. And if you can keep up the input, then the slide will be much less.
Okay, that makes sense. So a Slovak mum and a Finnish dad, neither of them speaks the other parent's language and they communicate together in English. They have a baby son. They're worried that the baby will be confused by these three languages and concerned that when they speak to the baby in their mother tongue, the other parent will be excluded as they don't understand. Any tips would be welcome.
Okay, so first of all, the baby won't be confused. So children are able to deal with multiple languages around them without kind of any known impediments. And so that one you don't have to worry about. It is true that when you have a baby, before they're talking to you, it can seem like it's going to be unwieldy to have this parent speaking Finnish to the child and that parent speaking Slovak to the child, and who understands what anybody's doing. But actually, as your child develops, very often they start becoming the go-between. And it develops in dynamic ways. I mean, when my daughter was 2.5, she used to turn to my husband and translate for him everything I said in French into English because she presumed he didn't understand. A, that's really good for her linguistic skills. B, it's really good for that social, emotional, and communication skills. But also she was seeing a need and meeting it. And that's also an impressive skill. And so it's about, again, the openness of conversation. That was a really funny thing you said to me in Slovak. Can you tell daddy in his language so he can understand too? Making sure that you're drawing on and developing that idea of moving between languages, and that we make sure that other people understand. But, because the parental language is English, there's every likelihood that as soon as the child is comfortable in English, they'll start wanting to use English with the parents anyway. So that's going to be your biggest issue.
Very much. I think we've probably got time for a couple more questions before we have to wrap up. Would you have any suggestions for us as parents of an 8-year-old with dyslexia who's at a Gaelic immersion school and their first language is English?
I would say any kind of therapy that's followed in for school purposes, if you can also follow in the other language. And so while it's true that being bilingual is not an impediment, having any kind of special educational need is not an impediment for being bilingual. It does mean sometimes that the kinds of interventions that you do in one language might need to be replicated in the other. And so that bilingual child will need somebody who understands the contrast points between how Gaelic is written and how English is written, and can work with them on those. And so it's just about getting support for literacy in both, but understanding that there's no reason why that child shouldn't learn to read and write in both as well as they would in one. It just takes more support.
Next up, Elizabeth asks, my son is adopted from Colombia. I speak Spanish to him now. He's been in Australia a few months. Is there anything other than speaking with him that we can do to encourage him to retain his language?
So again, it would be interesting and important for me to know how old he is, how old he was when he was adopted. But without that piece of information, again, I would say grow your Spanish community. Find a Spanish-speaking babysitter. Find a toddler group that helps other kids learn in Spanish. Find some television shows that you can watch with him. Make sure you're reading to him. But again, as much as possible, grow his community, so that you're not the only one trying to help him maintain his language. But I would like to say that I admire your resolve. I think it's really great that you're even trying, because a lot of times adopted children's language gets forgotten in the transition, and that's a shame.
Lovely. And from Nina, hi, we have potentially 4 languages, 3 languages at home and 1 in the community. Is 4 languages too much?
So 4 languages is not too much, but again, it's about being realistic about what level your child will achieve in each of them, depending on how much input they get. And so if they spend 80% of their time in 2 of those languages and 20% in the other 2, we have to accept that their fluency will be, very closely aligned with that. And so the amount of input that we give them will help determine what they're able to do with the language. And so while 4 isn't too many, it does mean that you have to accept that some of them, 1 or maybe 2 will be less active and more passive while they're young. But again, if they're getting it, there's every chance that as they grow older, if they're willing to engage and work harder, it will grow with them. But in the early stages, there'll be just a difference in their ability levels that can be rectified as they age with more time and more input. But they won't all develop exactly the same way at exactly the same time.
Okay, that makes sense. Federica lives in the UK and they speak Italian at home. The daughter had an English childminder from 9 months to 3 years, and her understanding of both languages is really good. Then lockdown started and her languages have regressed. Verbs she used to get right, she now gets wrong. Her skills seem basic for her age. Is this normal, and how can we support her?
Can you reiterate the languages?
So they speak Italian at home. They live in the UK, and they had an English childminder until.
So their English is getting not as good.
She said her languages have regressed. So
for both of her languages. Yeah. So it would be unusual to me that her Italian would regress while in lockdown with Italian speaking parents. And so I can't answer that one. I'd need to know a lot more about what's going on. And also, I think one of the things that we can't forget right now is that different kinds of children are under different amounts of pressure and feel that pressure very differently. And so for her, something linguistic might be related to her emotional state. Because I would expect that her Italian would be getting better if her parents are using Italian all the time, and her English might be getting more rustic. And so I think that's a complex question that probably needs a lot more information before I'd be comfortable offering any kind of advice.
That's great. And perhaps one more. This is a good one. Carmen's curious to know about Eowyn's view on translanguaging as a language practice. And if there's any example of parents who struggle to support their children's home heritage language due to a monolingual bias.
That's 2 questions, yes?
So your view on
So my view on translanguaging is very complex, and I think translanguaging means different things to different people at this point. There's translanguaging that we look at in terms of, the relationships and the social justice issues in the United States about languages. There's translanguaging in the Welsh context, which just means teach them in one language and have them write in another, and all kinds of variations in between. And so what I'm willing to say is that I think that being bilingual or multilingual is a dynamic state. We cannot entirely suppress what we know and how we use one language when we're using another. And I think that acknowledging and encouraging children to be linguistically flexible is a very good thing. Okay, so that's the first one. And the second one, the second one about monolingual bias, I have 100% met parents who wanted to have bilingual children and were not successful because they themselves had an innate monolingual bias towards the dominant language of the place where they lived. And so they felt like they valued their home language, but actually they didn't really in their actions. And so they ended up with monolingual children. Absolutely. And that's because, the pressures that society puts on parents can be immense in terms of language. The idea of putting your child into a school where they don't speak the language, that they speak an immigrant or minority language, is scary, especially when people are going to say, oh, but you've damaged your child. And so parents sometimes make decisions out of fear of damaging their child and veer towards monolingualism as a way to try and avoid that. And in fact, they usually end up with more problems than they might have if they had just persisted in bilingualism.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you for all your brilliant questions, everyone at home. And I'm really sorry that we didn't manage to get round to all of them today. Of course, what I would recommend, if you're interested, is that you buy a copy of this fabulous new book. We will, in a second, put up a code for you to use on our website, where you will get a 25% discount on the book. I just want to say thank you to Eowyn, who wants to say something as well.
I do. Somebody just popped up and said, can they contact me if I said their question's too complex? You can contact me through my blog. I take questions through my blog and turn them into a blog post, anonymous, 100%, as a way to be able to give parents more complex answers. So you can find me through my blog.
What's it called?
On raising bilingual children. I'll just put that here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Eowyn, for what's been a really interesting session. And I can see from the comments that everyone's found it really inspiring and supportive, which is precisely what we were aiming for. So thank you very much for doing this. Thank you, everyone, for watching. And goodbye from the UK. You can see our website address on there, which is www.multilingualmatters.com. And the code is BFEC25, which will get you a 25% discount off the book. And it's valued until the 15th of February. And Valentine's Day buying a copy of the book, if you so wish. Thank you very much for coming. And we are doing several of these sessions, so hopefully there'll be another one that will interest you very soon. Thank you, Eowyn, and good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.